What if the most obvious historical facts turn out to be beautifully packaged falsehoods or, even more alarmingly, half-truths that distort reality more than any fiction could? Before you are 30 stories, 30 myths that have lived in the minds of millions for centuries, and 30 realities that are far more captivating, dramatic, and incredible than anything you've heard before. This is not a list of debunked misconceptions from the internet. This is archival dust, the scent of ancient manuscripts, and the voices of those whom history has chosen to forget. Myth number 1. The face that conquered the world without a mirror. For centuries, artists have depicted her similarly: a high forehead, a slender nose, almond-shaped eyes, and slightly raised lips and a mysterious smile. Hollywood completed the rest. Elizabeth Taylor in luxurious garments adorned in gold, surrounded by slaves with fans, gazing down at the world from the heights of her unmatched beauty. Cleopatra. The very name has become synonymous with sensuality, female power through appearance, and the triumph of beauty over the reason of men. For ages, it was believed that it was her face that made her great. It was that alone that caused Julius Caesar, the coldest strategist of Rome, to lose his head. It was this visage that drove Mark Antony mad enough to gamble everything: his army, his honor, even the Roman Empire itself. Beauty that destroyed 2 worlds, poets wrote about her. Historians thought so. We think so. But here's the remarkable thing. The only surviving portrait of Cleopatra from her lifetime is found on coins. Coins featuring her profile, minted in her own kingdom under her supervision. And if you find these coins, housed in museums in London and Berlin, you will see something entirely unexpected: a prominent nose with a bump, a jutting chin. Sharp features far removed from the quote-unquote classical beauty standards of any era. Historian Joan Fletcher, who studied numismatic evidence from that time, wrote that if this woman would judge solely by her appearance, history would likely have forgotten her name. So what really happened? How did one woman manage to captivate 2 of the most powerful men of her time, retain control over the largest grain-producing power in the Mediterranean, and in 21 years of rule transform Egypt from a fading province into a center of global politics? The answer lies not in a mirror. It lies in a library. Cleopatra VII, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was apparently the first in her lineage to bother to learn the Egyptian language. Her ancestors ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, throughout which they communicated with their subjects only through translators, as the Macedonian Greeks who seized control of the land after Alexander deemed it unnecessary to stoop to the language of savages. Cleopatra learned Egyptian. Then she learned Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, and Parthian. According to the ancient Greek historian Plutarch, she spoke 9 languages, and her voice was like a musical instrument. She switched between dialects effortlessly, and each interlocutor felt as though the queen was speaking directly to them in their language about what mattered to them. Imagine Caesar, a man accustomed to having the entire world bend to his will. A figure who had encountered thousands of petitioners, rulers, and kings. And then, suddenly, a young woman who converses with him in Latin, quotes Homer in Greek, discusses Egyptian cults using the priest's language, and analyzes military campaigns with the precision of an experienced general. She was knowledgeable in astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and history. She was a living library, in a city that housed the greatest library in the world. Her meeting with Antony in Tarsus in the year 41 before Christ became a legend while the witnesses were still alive. Yes, she arrived on a ship with purple sails, infused with fragrances. Yes, she was dressed like the goddess Isis. But all of this was theater, a meticulously planned political performance. Cleopatra understood that Antony was a theatrical man, enamored with grandeur and symbols. She spoke to him in his language, the language of imagery. And later, when the curtain fell, she conversed with him in the language of his intellect. This struck him more profoundly than any beauty. The ancient world did not believe that a woman could govern a state through intellect, as opposed to physicality. Rome, having defeated Cleopatra, could not afford to acknowledge that they had lost a battle of wits. It was much more convenient to label her a seductress, a sorceress, an Eastern femme fatale who had intoxicated great men with love potions. The myth of Cleopatra's beauty arose from male humiliation, from the impossibility of conceding that they had been bested by a woman armed solely with her mind. And here lies the paradox that provokes reflection. The longer this myth lives on, the more it robs Cleopatra of her true identity. By turning her into an icon of beauty, history strips her of the title she rightfully deserved, perhaps the most brilliant political mind of her time. A woman who balanced for 21 years on the edge between Egypt and Rome, successfully preventing either side from engulfing the other. A woman who lost only because she faced Octavian Augustus, a man whose coldness was greater than even the sharpest intellect. Her beauty is a myth born from an era that could not see a woman in any other light. Her reality is far more captivating, and considerably less convenient for those who prefer to view her merely as a face. This myth is birthed from a troubling truth. The real power of a woman has always scared more than any beauty. The next myth also speaks of power, but now of the power of tradition, a construct fashioned just the day before. Myth number 2. A cup filled with invention. There are images that seem eternal: a misty London evening, a fireplace, old armchairs, and, inevitably, a cup of tea. Hot, strong, with milk. The British and tea are akin to the French and wine, or the Italians and coffee. It is the essence, the identity, the DNA of a nation. When you think of the United Kingdom, you think of tea, and the British themselves willingly embrace this image. The tea-drinking nation. 5 o'clock is tea time. We drink tea in any crisis. Yet here is a question that, for some reason, is rarely asked. When exactly did the British begin drinking tea? The response is so surprising that it deserves a second look. Tea became a widespread British tradition only in the middle of the 18th century. Prior to that, for most of British history, meaning thousands of years, tea did not exist at all. The national beverage was ale, a dark, thick beer that was consumed during breakfast, lunch, and dinner by men, women, and children alike. This was because the water from the Thames was dangerously contaminated, and brewing killed off most pathogens. A medieval Londoner might drink several pints of ale daily, not out of indulgence, but as a survival strategy. When did tea make its entrance? The Portuguese brought it to Britain in the mid-17th century, and for the first few decades it remained a novelty for the wealthy, an exotic plaything showcased to guests as a sign of prosperity and sophistication. A significant influence was one woman, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess who became the wife of King Charles II in 1662. She introduced the tea-drinking habit as part of her dowry, and immediately tea became fashionable at court. Everything the queen did was worthy of imitation. However, even after that, tea remained a luxury for the elite for nearly another century. The true tea revolution occurred due purely to economic and political reasons, linked to one of the darkest chapters of British history. The East India Company, which controlled trade with Asia, discovered that tea could be sold at a lower price by utilizing labor from seized plantations. As the price dropped, tea flooded into the masses. Simultaneously, the British government began a concerted effort to combat gin. A gin epidemic in the 18th century was ravaging the working class, and authorities sought to redirect the public's thirst towards something more wholesome. Thus, tea became the national drink, not through centuries of organic tradition, but literally over a few decades of targeted policy and aggressive trade. The afternoon tea tradition at 5 o'clock is even younger. It was popularized by Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, in the 18th century because she found the time between lunch and dinner to be dull. One aristocrat established the custom, another picked it up, and after a few generations it became an ancient British custom. There lies a startling truth about how traditions are born. What value does a millennia-old tradition hold if it really only dates back about 250 years? And how many other timeless customs will reveal themselves to be equally recent fabrications if one examines them honestly? This myth stems from a nation's desire to have roots deeper than they truly are. The next myth arises from a craving for spectacle, because what occurred in the arena was far from what is depicted in films. Myth number 3, the arena that was misunderstood. The roar of the crowd, sand soaked in blood. 2 men, one defeated, the other with a sword at his throat. The crowd screams, thumbs turned down. The victor lowers his blade. The curtain falls. Death as spectacle, as sport, as culture. This is precisely how we envision gladiatorial combat, the epitome of Roman brutality, an endless slaughter in which every defeat signified the end. This depiction has become so entrenched in culture that it is nearly impossible to challenge. Hollywood has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to reinforce it. Textbooks often overlook the nuances. And very few people ponder the simple question, how profitable was this really? Profitable is the key term. Because Rome, despite its thirst for spectacle, was primarily a civilization of shrewd merchants. And a gladiator is not disposable material. Rather, they are a valuable asset. Training a gladiator took years. Typically, a prisoner of war or a criminal would become an apprentice, acquired by the lanista for a significant sum. Following this, there would be months and often years of training, a specialized diet. And this is no mere figure of speech. Studies of the bones of gladiators buried in Ephesus, conducted in 2014, demonstrated that their diet was predominantly vegetarian, rich in carbohydrates and calcium. They were literally fed barley, beans, and boiled animal bones to strengthen bones and build subcutaneous fat that would protect them from injuries. They were provided with the best physicians, including the renowned Galen, the father of ancient medicine, who began his career as a physician at a gladiator school in Pergamon. These were living investments, and like any investment, they were safeguarded. The evidence that has survived to us, graffiti from Pompeii, official records, inscriptions on tombstones, presents a vastly different picture. Most fights did not end in death, but rather in defeat. The vanquished gladiator would raise a finger, a symbol of the plea for mercy. And in most instances, mercy was granted. The organizer of the games might spare the defeated simply because killing meant paying the owner a compensation. Why pay when it was possible to free them and have them fight another 20 times? Researcher Colin Ward, who examined epigraphic evidence about gladiators, estimated that in the known bouts, death occurred in roughly 1 out of every 9 contests, and even then, typically under exceptional circumstances. The famous thumbs down that we associate with a death sentence was likely never such a signal at all. The Latin phrase pollice verso meant turned thumb without specifying the direction. The gesture for death could have been quite different, perhaps a clenched fist or an outstretched hand. The very image of the gladiator as a doomed figure is a late Roman and medieval construct. When Christianity came to power, it needed to demonize its pagan past. What better symbolized the soulless brutality of Rome? The arena. Thus the canon arose. Rome equals blood, gladiators equal death. The church found an ideal contrast for its narrative of light and darkness. In reality, it was much more mundane and humane. It was a sport. Brutal, dangerous, but still sport. With stars, fans, advertising contracts, romantic liaisons with admirers, and, apparently, promising retirement options for those who chose to retire. This myth was born from the need of later eras for a convenient villain. The next tale is about a man who has been depicted as an antagonist for centuries, although he turned out to be one of the most complex builders of the state in history. Myth number 4. The tyrant who built a nation. Ivan the Terrible. This name alone sounds like a verdict. We encounter him in textbooks, with a mad gaze, a scepter in his hand, the scene of the murder of his own son captured by Repin with such penetrating force that it feels more real than any document. Terrible entered history as a paragon of despotism, the oprichnina, bloody executions, the plunder of Novgorod, paranoia that escalated into state terror. The lesson from the textbook is clear: a great villain who shattered the country. But here's what textbooks typically do not address: Ivan IV inherited a nation that would today be referred to as a failed state. He was 3 years old when his father, Vasily III, passed away. He was 8 when his mother, Elena Glinskaya, died. The subsequent years of his childhood were marked by the terror of the boyars. Noble clans battled for power over the helpless boy sovereign, executing one another and humiliating young Ivan, showing him from infancy that authority rests solely on strength and fear. This was his education in governance. Is it any wonder that he absorbed these lessons? However, there is one undeniable aspect about the man often labeled as a tyrant. He was one of the most active reformers in Russian history. During the first 15 years of his reign, before paranoia took over, he transformed the country beyond recognition. The Zemsky Sobor of 1551 was the first experience of representative governance in Russia, gathering not only boyars but also representatives of merchants. The Judicial Code of 1550 was a systematic codification of laws that curtailed the abuses of local rulers. The introduction of local self-government in the form of gubernatorial and zemsky elections allowed provincial communities to elect officials to investigate crimes. Military reforms established the first professional infantry, the streltsy. The beginning of printing in Russia. The first domestic printing house appeared under Ivan in 1563. And most importantly, what is usually not mentioned in relation to the tyrant terrible, it was he who initiated the annexation of Siberia. The Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan were subdued in the 50 years of the 16th century. This expanded Russia to the east and opened the way to resources that would, centuries later, make it a global power. Repin captured the murder of the sun, and this canvas became iconic. But was this scene real? Modern historians have their doubts. The German diplomat Heinrich von Staden, who lived at the Moscow court, left accounts of many of Ivan's atrocities, yet he does not mention the murder of the son. This event is known primarily from a single source, the notes of the papal legate Antonio Posavino, who arrived in Moscow a few years after the supposed incident and was not an eyewitness. There are studies suggesting that the son died from an illness. This is not an attempt to exonerate a person under whom the Novgorod pogrom claimed thousands of lives. This is an effort to restore complexity to someone whom history has denied it. Ivan the Terrible was not merely a tyrant, he was a tragedy, a state builder whose own psychology shattered him, a ruler who understood how to construct, yet did not know how to refrain from destruction. This myth is born out of history's need for simplistic representations of evil. The next arises from the desire for a straightforward explanation of something that was far more intricate. Myth number 5. The War for the Holy Sepulchre. Deus vult. God wills it. The battle cry with which knights donned crosses on their cloaks and set out on a long journey eastward at the end of the 11th century. The Crusades are arguably the most famous example of a religious war in history. We were told that the Christian West rose against the Muslim East in the name of liberating the Holy Sepulchre. Faith against faith. God against Allah. The purity of motivation, religious conviction, versus a similar conviction on the opposing side. However, if we look beyond the slogans and examine what actually happened, the picture becomes much more convoluted and far less pious. It's essential to start with why the late 11th century was significant. By that time, Jerusalem had been under Muslim control for 4 centuries. 4 centuries, and Christian pilgrims were still visiting the Holy Land without difficulty. What had changed? Power had shifted. The Seljuk Turks, who captured Jerusalem in 1073, proved to be far less tolerant of pilgrims than the previous Fatimid rulers. This closed off a crucial source of income for local Christians, leading to a flood of complaints directed at Rome. Pope Urban II, who proclaimed the First Crusade in 1095 at Clermont, was motivated by factors that were far from pure theology. He sought to unite the fragmented Christian world under the authority of Rome. He aimed to address the issue of the European nobility who were engaging in conflicts with one another instead of fighting the infidels. He wanted to mend relations with Constantinople following the schism of 1054. The crusade was a political initiative disguised in religious packaging. What followed is even more telling. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 did not reach Jerusalem. Instead, it arrived at Constantinople, the capital of the Orthodox Christian state, and looted it. The Crusaders plundered and burned the greatest Christian city of the time, killing thousands of Christians and desecrating Christian sanctities. Leading this endeavor was the aging, nearly blind Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo, reportedly over 90 years old. His motive was clear: to eliminate a trade competitor for Venice. In the context of the Crusades themselves, alliances were frequently forged with Muslim rulers against other Christian leaders. Henry II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who embarked on the Sixth Crusade in the year 1228, was excommunicated by the Pope. Yet he successfully negotiated with the Egyptian Sultan Al-Kamil for the transfer of Jerusalem without a single sword raised. The Pope was furious. A religious war, where one of the key participants adeptly communes with the quote-unquote enemy while his own religious leader condemns him. Was the religious dimension genuine? Absolutely. Individuals truly died with the name of God on their lips. However, behind that dimension lurked the land hunger of European nobility, the trade interests of Italian city-states, the political ambitions of Rome and Constantinople, and simple human greed disguised under a noble pretext. The myth of purely religious crusades is convenient for all parties involved. For the Church, as it allows separation of true faith from abuses. For the Muslim world, as it provides a straightforward narrative of Western aggression. For the West, as it enables a portrayal of it as a different time, different people. The reality, however, is far more uncomfortable. This was a geopolitical crisis where religion served as a language rather than a driving force. This myth arises from the inability to accept that holy wars are rarely truly sacred. The next myth concerns a man who was regarded as the creator of history, although history existed long before him. Myth number 6, the window that was already opened. Peter the Great, the one who cut a window to Europe, pulling Russia from the medieval darkness and exposing it to the light of progress, an image that became a state myth even during Peter's lifetime and has only strengthened since. Russia before Peter is depicted as a land of savage boyars in fur hats, with beards down to their waists, dirty and superstitious. Russia after is characterized by St. Petersburg, a navy, academies, shaved faces, and European garments. The contrast is striking, yet it is almost entirely fabricated. Long before Peter embarked on his famous grand embassy across Europe in the year 1697, foreigners had already been living in Russia. They had been there for a long time and in considerable numbers. The German quarter in Moscow, known as the German Sloboda, where Western specialists settled, had existed since the mid-16th century during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. By the mid-17th century, thousands of foreigners lived there: doctors, military engineers, merchants, artisans. Young Peter, it is noteworthy, found his first teachers and friends there: the Dutchman Timmerman, the Scotsman Gordon, and the Genevan Lefort. Peter's father, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the Quietist, was actively translating Western books into Russian, inviting foreign masters, and establishing regiments of new formation according to Western military models long before Peter's reforms. His favorite, Artemon Matveev, maintained a household which adhered to Western customs, without the seclusion of women in terems, with the reading of foreign literature, and with theatrical performances. The first theater in Russia was established under Alexei Mikhailovich in the year 1672, 3 years before Peter's birth. So, what exactly did Peter do? He accomplished something significant, yet different. He implemented a forced and systematic Europeanization of state policy. He didn't merely open a window, he broke down a wall. The distinction lies not in the direction, but in the method and speed. Boyars were compelled to shave their beards under the threat of taxation, foreigners were brought in large groups, and nobles were sent abroad for education under the risk of falling into disfavor. This was forced modernization, a revolution from above. However, it was this violent, hasty, and brutal nature of Peter's reforms that created the main issue: a deep cultural divide between the Europeanized elite and the rest of the country, a divide that Russia felt even 200 years later. This was the very rift between the educated society and the people which fueled the revolutionary movement of the 19th century. Thus, Peter was not the creator of Russian Europeanization. He was its accelerator and radicalizer. This changes everything, for while the isolation of Russia before Peter was a myth, his greatness turns out to be far more complex. He did not save the country from darkness, but rather violently shattered one cultural model for another, and the repercussions of this rupture echoed for centuries. This myth was born from the state's need for a founder, a mythological prime mover. The next arose from the church's need for a figure of horror. Myth number 7. The fire that was almost non-existent. When the term Inquisition is uttered, an image immediately springs to mind: a public square, a pole, a pyre. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of victims burned for their faith. The figures mentioned in popular books vary from several hundred thousand to 9 million. The latter number typically pertains to alleged victims of the witch hunts, which are conflated with inquisitorial processes into one terrifying narrative. This image is one of the most successful historical exaggerations in European culture. In 1998, the Vatican took an unprecedented step. It opened the archives of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, essentially the archives of the Inquisition, to a group of international historians. This was the first time scholars were granted access to the complete documents. The results of their research, published in the 2000s, turned the conventional narrative on its head. The Spanish Inquisition, the most famous and reputedly the harshest in its entire existence, from 1480 to 1830, sentenced approximately 3,000 to 5,000 individuals to death. These are alarming figures, yet over 3.5 centuries, considering that the population of Spain alone numbered in the millions. In comparison, secular courts during the same period issued death sentences significantly more frequently and executed them with much less humanity. The Inquisition, despite its reputation, had more clearly defined procedures for defense than most secular tribunals. The witch trials, which claimed between 40,000 and 60,000 lives across Europe, were also primarily not the result of inquisitorial courts. Mass executions of witches predominantly occurred in Protestant regions of Germany and Switzerland, where the Inquisition was non-existent. The Spanish Inquisition approached witchcraft accusations with considerable skepticism. Its theologians considered belief in true magic to be superstitious. In 1609, the Tribunal of Logroño examined a case regarding witches from Navarre, and Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias, after reviewing the evidence, concluded that no witchcraft practices existed and that it was all mere popular superstition and hallucinations. He insisted on the release of the accused. So, where does the myth of millions of victims originate? It was shaped by the anti-Catholic propaganda of the Reformation era. Protestant pamphleteers in the 16th and 17th centuries deliberately inflated the image of inquisitorial horror, and they succeeded to such an extent that even in the 21st century, most people cite figures that exceed the actual numbers by hundreds of times. This does not imply that the Inquisition was a virtuous institution. It means that the truth about it, which includes the systematic persecution of minorities, torture as a legitimate interrogation tool, and the destruction of intellectual life in entire regions, is sufficiently monstrous without exaggerations. By adding non-existent millions, we do not make history scarier. We only obscure the real victims in a fog of numbers. This myth was born from propaganda that morphed into history. The next myth arises from colonial pride, which required an image of the naive savage. Myth number 8. The god whom nobody expected. The year is 1519, the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Ships appear on the horizon, ships unlike any seen before. From them emerge beings in metal, riding strange animals. According to the version that textbooks have repeated for centuries, the Aztecs fell to their knees in astonishment. It is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, arriving from the east as foretold. Hernán Cortés was mistaken for a god, and thus the conquest of Mexico proceeded so smoothly. This narrative is so captivating that one hesitates to verify it. Unfortunately, it is almost entirely fabricated. Historian Camilla Townsend, in her foundational work, Fifth Sun, published in 2019, accomplished something that had been done too infrequently before her. She read Aztec sources in their original language, Nahuatl. Not Spanish chronicles written by conquerors or by indigenous people converted to Christianity decades after the conquest. It was the sources in the language of the Aztecs themselves. What did she discover? The entire tale that the Aztecs regarded Cortés as Quetzalcoatl appears in sources no earlier than a few decades post-conquest, when the Aztec elite, attempting to comprehend the catastrophe that had occurred, constructed narratives that explained the impossible. We lost because we mistook them for gods. This is a way to retain dignity. It shifts the narrative from, "we were defeated," to, "we were deceived in a supernatural manner." What do early sources indicate? Moctezuma II met Cortés with cautious diplomatic calculation, rather than with religious awe. Aztec rulers engaged in active reconnaissance. Messengers reported the arrival of the Spaniards months before they appeared at court. Montezuma was aware that these were human beings, bold, armed, and dangerous, yet human. Why then did Cortés enter Tenochtitlan almost without obstruction? Not because he was mistaken for a god. It was because Montezuma was conducting a complicated diplomatic maneuver, hoping to ascertain the strength of the newcomers and find a way to neutralize them. It was because the Aztec Empire was detested by the subjugated peoples, from which Cortés skillfully gathered allies. It was because the Spaniards carried diseases that had decimated the population even before a decisive confrontation. And it was because Cortés was an exceptional tactician, adept at turning local conflicts to his advantage. The myth of the god was not born among the Aztecs. It was a creation of the Spanish colonizers, who found it immensely convenient. If the indigenous people worshipped their conquerors as gods, then it was not conquest, it was providence. It was not a crime, it was destiny. This myth was born from the colonial need for self-justification. The subsequent legend was derived from a narrative that was more beautiful than the truth, yet the truth proved to be no less impressive. Myth number 9. The abyss that wasn't Sparta. Just the mention of this word conjures an image. Stern warriors, hardened from infancy, who rejected the weak by casting them into the apathetai pit. The city needed only the strong. Therefore, every infant born with a defect was doomed. This notion has formed the basis of our entire understanding of Spartan society, a ruthless natural selection elevated to state policy. But where exactly was this abyss? Ancient sources refer to the apothetai, the place where they are taken, as a chasm on the mountain of Taygetus. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st or 2nd centuries AD, describes this practice in the life of Lycurgus. This sounds convincing. However, Plutarch lived around 600 years after the height of Sparta. It is akin to a modern author writing about medieval England based on Renaissance sources, with the inevitable distortions, exaggerations, and additions. When archaeologists began to seriously explore the ravines of Mount Taygetus in the 20th century, they discovered human bones, but predominantly of adult males, not infants. Historians like Paul Cartledge, Stephen Hodkinson, and other leading experts on Sparta cautiously concluded there is no direct evidence of the mass killing of newborns by throwing them into the abyss. What was the reality? Sparta, like the rest of the ancient world, practiced the exposure of unwanted children. This was a Greco-Roman custom, not a Spartan peculiarity. Infants were left on the mountainside or beside the road, hoping that slaveholders or childless families would take them in. It was brutal, but it wasn't murder in the strict sense. As for the specifically Spartan tradition, elders would inspect newborns and the weak ones would be returned to their fathers for exposure. This practice differed from the general Greek one in that the decision was made by the state rather than the family, but only that. The image of the abyss into which infants fell was crafted by late antique and medieval authors who employed Sparta as a symbol, sometimes admiring it, sometimes horrified by it. Sparta has always served as a canvas upon which the fantasies of other eras were projected. For Rousseau, it represented an ideal of simplicity and virtue, while for the Nazis, it was a model of racial purity. In both instances, the real Sparta was less significant than the imagined Sparta. This myth arises from the need for an archetype of extremes, be it ideal or monstrous. What follows tells the tale of a man whom history has rendered great, although his true story is far more tragic. Myth number 10. The hero without victories. Mark Antony. A name that resonates as a synonym for strength and grandeur. In popular imagination, he is a brilliant general, a worthy rival of Caesar, who conquered Egypt and was conquered by Cleopatra. Shakespeare penned a tragedy about him. After all, Shakespeare didn't work with poor material. Antony ranks among the greatest military commanders of antiquity. However, if one examines his record with a dispassionate eye, the picture becomes far more ambiguous. Antony was indeed an excellent tactician in close quarters. In battles where he had to lead his troops personally, he was fearless and charismatic. His soldiers adored him, which is no small feat. Yet, strategically, his career is a narrative of nearly non-stop calamities. His campaign against Parthia in 36 BC was a military venture that ended in one of the most humiliating retreats in Roman history. Antony led a vast army into Parthia. Estimates vary, but it was about 100,000 soldiers, and lost a third of them without winning a single significant battle. The Parthians destroyed his supply trains, cut off supply routes, and exhausted his forces with swift attacks and immediate withdrawals. Antony did not grasp this kind of tactics. He was accustomed to Greco-Roman conventions where opponents would clash in open fields. The retreat from Parthia cost the lives of 20,000 soldiers. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC, a naval encounter that determined the fate of Rome, was lost by Antony so dramatically that historians still debate whether it amounted to betrayal. His fleet was anchored in the Bay of Actium, blocked by Agrippa, the admiral of Octavian. His troops were ill, deserted, and defected to the enemy. At the decisive moment, Cleopatra withdrew with her 60 ships and made for Egypt. Without hesitation, Antony abandoned his fleet and army to follow her. This decision perhaps speaks volumes about who Mark Antony truly was, a passionate, impulsive man who, at a critical juncture, prioritized personal desires over duty to the state. A soldier rather than a strategist. An actor instead of a director. Shakespeare turned this into a tragedy of love. History transformed it into the tale of a great general. The reality was more modest and humane. He was a charming, brave, and deeply unhappy man whose circumstances elevated him beyond his capabilities. This myth stems from the romantic need for a worthy hero. Born from geography, which shifts with politics. Myth 11. The capital that moved. All roads lead to Rome. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the empire, the nucleus of Western civilization. When we mention the Roman Empire, we envision the Forum, the Colosseum, the Capitoline. The very term Rome has become synonymous with authority. Isn't it seemingly evident that Rome has always been the capital of the Roman Empire? However, here's the intriguing part. This obvious statement holds true only for the early centuries. In reality, during the last centuries of what we refer to as the Western Roman Empire, Rome was not the capital, and not for a brief period. By the end of the 3rd century AD, under Diocletian's reforms, the empire began to be governed from various centers. Mediolanum, present-day Milan, emerged as the primary residence for the Western Emperor due to its proximity to the perilous borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Nicomedia in the east, now Izmit in Turkey, became the residence for the Eastern co-emperor. Rome was transforming into a ceremonial capital, a symbolic city rather than a center of real administration. When the Visigoths, led by Alaric, marched on Rome in the early 5th century, the Western Emperor Honorius was not in Rome. He resided in Ravenna, protected by marshes that rendered it nearly impregnable. The sacking of Rome in 410 AD, one of the most psychologically impactful events in history, occurred essentially in a city that had not been a true capital for several decades. The eastern part of the empire had moved even further. In 1124, prior to the division, Constantine the Great established a new capital, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This capital would endure as the center of the Roman Empire for another 1,000 years, until 1453. For a millennium, the inhabitants of this city identified themselves as Romans, spoke Greek, and lived by Roman laws. And yet we dub this chapter Byzantium, as if it were a different civilization altogether. Rome maintained its political significance for centuries. It persisted in the collective consciousness, and minds, as a rule, write textbooks. This myth arises from the power of symbolism that triumphed over geography. The next has emerged from laziness that has turned a complex civilization into a caricature. Myth 12. The dirt that never existed. Horned helmets, dirty beards, rough feasts with scraps discarded directly onto the floor. Barbarians from the north, bringing only destruction, burning monasteries, killing scholars, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. Vikings in popular culture have become the epitome of civilized barbarism. Dangerous people, skilled in violence, yet primitive in every other respect. None of these details withstand a confrontation with actual evidence. Let's start with helmets. Not one of the several thousand surviving Scandinavian helmets from the Viking Age has horns. Not a single one. Horned helmets did exist in Scandinavia, but they date back to the Bronze Age, a millennium and a half before the Viking Age. In the 9th to 11th centuries, when Vikings terrorized the shores of Europe, their helmets were round or conical, lacking any embellishments. The image of horns on helmets was invented by a 19th century artist, and this idea became popular. Now, about the filth. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Scandinavian traders on the Volga in the year 1922, provided a detailed account of their lifestyle. He noted that they combed their hair every morning and that they bathed regularly, taking turns in a single basin, a practice that Ibn Fadlan deemed rather unhygienic from an Arab perspective, but not dirty. Scandinavian archaeological finds are replete with personal hygiene items, such as combs, tweezers, and ear spoons. A weekly bath was a standard aspect of Scandinavian life. Hence, the Swedish word lördag, which means Saturday, literally translates to washing day. Regarding wholesale destruction, the Vikings were primarily traders. Their trade routes stretched from Newfoundland to Constantinople and from Greenland to the Caspian Sea. The trade route known as from the Varangians to the Greeks, which connected Scandinavia through Novgorod and Kiev to Constantinople, was one of the main arteries of medieval trade. The cities that we often think of as sacked were frequently either established or significantly expanded by them. Dublin was founded by Scandinavians. Kiev was fortified and developed by Scandinavian rulers. Normandy, which became the foundation for the conquest of England, literally means land of the Northmen. Legal systems, trade agreements, and a complex mythology with a developed writing tradition are not the traits of caricatured barbarians. The image of the dirty savage Viking was primarily constructed by monasteries, the only centers of literacy in Western Europe at that time. Naturally, monasteries remembered the raids and chronicled history from their perspective. Had the Scandinavians written the textbooks themselves, the narrative would have been different. This myth arose from the fact that history is always penned by those who possess the parchment. The next myth was fueled by nationalism, which framed a great individual within the context of a nation that did not yet exist. Myth number 13. The Greek who never was. Alexander the Great. One of only 2 or 3 individuals in history who has permanently borne the title, the Great. A Greek who conquered the world, carrying Greek culture on the tip of his spear. This is how he is presented in most Western textbooks, as the last great product of Greek civilization, its exporter and apotheosis. However, the Greeks themselves did not view him that way. They had compelling reasons for this. Alexander was a Macedonian. During the 4th century BCE, Macedonia occupied a rather ambiguous position within the Greek world. The Greek city-states, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, looked upon the Macedonians with considerable disdain. For many Greeks of that era, the Macedonians were seen as semi-barbarians. They spoke in a dialect that educated Athenians could hardly comprehend. Their kings ruled monarchically rather than according to the principles of the polis, and their aristocrats were hunters and revelers rather than refined philosophers. Demosthenes, the greatest orator of Athens, in his Philippics, speeches against Alexander's father, Philip II, referred to the Macedonians as people who could not even afford a decent slave. For Demosthenes, Philip represented a barbaric chieftain who threatened Greek freedom, not a fellow Greek. When Alexander ascended to power and wished to participate in the Olympic Games, which were exclusively for Greeks, he needed to provide proof of his Greek heritage through an alleged connection to Hercules. This in itself indicates a great deal. If it were already obvious that he was Greek, no proof would have been necessary. As for Alexander's army and entourage, they were Macedonian. His closest companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Antigonus, were all Macedonians. The tactics Alexander employed with remarkable success, including the oblique phalanx and cavalry charges, were military innovations developed by Alexander's father. So why did Alexander become identified as a Greek? In part, it was because he sought this identification himself. He admired Homer, carried the Iliad on his campaigns, and aspired to surpass Achilles. His tutor, Aristotle, was Greek, and Greek culture stood as an ideal for Alexander. He genuinely spread Hellenism to the conquered peoples. However, adopting a culture does not equate to being its offspring. Alexander was indeed great, there is no doubt about that. Yet this greatness belonged to a man who stood at the crossroads of worlds, using Greek culture as a tool and the Macedonian military apparatus as a weapon. Trying to force him into a single national framework, whether Greek, Macedonian, or, as Balkan nationalists sometimes do, any other, is not history. It is politics. This myth is born from nationalism, projecting contemporary categories onto the ancient world. The next myth concerns a trade route that turned out to be longer and more complex than is commonly believed. Myth number 14, tea that took longer. We already know that the ancient British tradition of tea is quite a modern concept. However, there is another tea myth that lives in the shadow of the first. It involves how tea actually reached Europe. The commonly accepted narrative states, the Portuguese, who established the first maritime contact with China and Japan in the early 16th century, brought tea to the West. They opened this route, were the first to appreciate the beverage, and it is thanks to them that Europe became acquainted with tea. This is a half-truth, which is often worse than a straightforward lie. The Portuguese indeed encountered tea in China and Japan in the first half of the 16th century. They appreciated it, but did not bring it back to Europe as a commodity. Why? Because Portuguese trade with Asia was focused on spices, silk, and porcelain. Tea was bulky and quickly lost its properties during long sea voyages, causing merchants to deem it commercially unviable for a long time. So, while the Portuguese were the first to sample it, they were unable or unwilling to transport it to Europe in significant quantities. Ironically, the Dutch were the ones who introduced tea as a commercial product to Europe. The Dutch East India Company brought the first commercial shipment of Chinese tea to Amsterdam around the year 1610. It was the Dutch who established regular trade, and it was specifically through the Netherlands that tea spread across continental Europe. However, the story of how tea came to India, the largest producer today, is even more fascinating. Indian tea did not exist as a culture until the 19th century. All the tea was imported from China, which created a massive trade deficit that the British were eager to eliminate by any means necessary. Ultimately, they decided to cultivate tea in India themselves. This required an individual named Robert Fortune, a botanist sent to China by the East India Company in 1848 on a reconnaissance mission to steal samples of tea plants and, more importantly, to entice Chinese tea masters to move to India. Essentially, this was state-sponsored industrial espionage. Thus, Indian tea, Assam, Darjeeling, reflects Chinese techniques, varieties, and knowledge that were transferred to Indian soil as a result of a carefully orchestrated theft. The story behind each cup is far more captivating than it initially appears. This myth is born out of national pride, which favors straightforward narratives. The next tale revolves around a project that became a symbol of its era and highlights the names that were erased from it. Myth number 15. The Bomb with Foreign Names. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. An American plane drops a bomb that changed the world. In the collective consciousness, this moment belongs to America. American scientists, American funding, American decisions. The Manhattan Project, an American triumph. This is one of those narratives that is so deeply intertwined with national identity that questioning it feels almost sacrilegious. But here's what's interesting. A significant portion of the scientific foundation for the atomic bomb was laid by individuals who fled to America from Nazi Germany. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who emigrated to the United States via Great Britain. He was the first to develop the concept of nuclear chain reaction in 1933. In 1939, he was the one who convinced Einstein to sign a letter to Roosevelt that became the catalyst for the Manhattan Project. Ironically, he was one of the staunchest opponents of using the bomb against civilian populations at the end of the war. Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist who fled to the US after Mussolini enacted racial laws threatening his Jewish wife. It was Fermi who, in 1942, created the world's first artificial nuclear reactor beneath the stands of a university stadium in Chicago, achieving the first controlled chain reaction. Without this experiment, there would have been no bomb. Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist and father of quantum mechanics who fled occupied Denmark in 1943, literally by fishing boat across the strait and later by plane from a British airbase, almost suffocating in an oxygen mask that was too large for him. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project and simultaneously transmitting all key technical solutions to the Soviet intelligence. It was precisely his information that enabled the USSR to develop its own bomb in 1949, much earlier than American analysts believed was possible. The Manhattan Project was an unprecedented international scientific endeavor. Among its key participants were citizens of Hungary, Italy, Denmark, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Austria. The Americans constructed the organization, infrastructure, financing, and military component. However, the physics that made the bomb feasible originated in Europe, and significantly from that Europe that Hitler had forced to flee. This myth stems from a national monopoly on success. The next one arises from a geographical error that has become part of history. Myth number 16. The field that wasn't there. June 18, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo is one of those events that divided history into before and after. The end of the Napoleonic era, the collapse of French ambitions, and the coalition's ultimate victory. The name Waterloo has become synonymous. To suffer a Waterloo means to endure a final, crushing defeat. And almost everyone knows this took place in Belgium, not far from Brussels. Today, there stands a massive artificial hill, the Lion's Mound, built in honor of the victory. Tourists flock there, souvenirs are sold. It serves as a place of remembrance. A small detail, the village of Waterloo, which lent its name to the battle, was nearly uninvolved in the actual fight. Wellington established his headquarters in Waterloo. Thus, in his victory report, he wrote, "From Waterloo." But the main combat actions occurred roughly 3 kilometers to the south, near the villages of Mont-Saint-Jean and La Haye-Saint. The French refer to this battle differently. For them, it is the Battle of Mont-Saint-Jean. For Napoleon and the French military tradition, this makes sense. Battles are named after the place where they actually take place, not the headquarters of the victor. But the victors write history, and Wellington reported from Waterloo, so Waterloo became the battle's name for the entire world. It may seem trivial, until one realizes that the principle, the location of the winner's headquarters becomes the name of the event, reflects a deeper truth. Victors not only win battles, They also assign titles to them, rewrite their meanings, and determine what will be included in textbooks. Napoleon himself, in his memoirs from St. Helena, found many reasons for his defeat, and many of them are quite convincing. The tardiness of Grouchy, who was supposed to delay the Prussians but failed, the indecisiveness of Marshal Ney at a critical moment, Napoleon's own illness that day, presumably hemorrhoids that deprived him of the ability to command from horseback. History, as you can see, is sometimes defined by physiology. This myth arises from the simple fact: the one who writes the report names the battle. The following one is born from a stubborn reluctance to accept that a hero can come from the wrong family. Myth number 17. The shepherdess who did not tend sheep. Joan of Arc. A simple peasant girl from the village of Domremy, tending sheep and hearing voices of saints, rushing to save France. This story is so beautifully simple that it has become one of France's foremost national myths, a symbol that an ordinary person from the countryside can change history. But what if the simple peasant girl was a bit more complex than she appears? Let us begin with the village. Domremy is a small settlement on the border of Lorraine. Jean's father, Jacques d'Arc, was neither a shepherd nor a laborer. He served as the village mayor, a person holding administrative duties and owning land. By the standards of 15th century rural France, this was a respected position of moderate means. The d'Arc family belonged to the social class that today would be described as solid middle, neither aristocratic nor destitute. Things get more intriguing. From the very beginning, Jeanne was accepted at the court of the Dauphin Charles with surprising ease. A peasant girl approaching the prince heir. It sounds like a fairy tale. However, in practice, the pathway for a commoner to reach the prince in feudal France was obstructed by numerous barriers. How did she manage it? Researchers, including historian Gerard Pem, highlight several details that do not align with the image of a simple girl. Her ability to handle horses and weapons are skills not commonly acquired in a village. Her tactical thinking was noted by contemporaries, her talent for negotiating with military leaders. Some historians suggest a theory of more noble origins, potentially through illegitimate or extramarital connections within aristocratic circles, which would explain both her skills and the ease with which the court accepted her. This remains a hypothesis. There is no direct evidence. Yet, even discounting this, the image of the shepherdess proves to be significantly oversimplified. Jeanne was a skilled military organizer. The Orléans campaign was planned with precision. She was an experienced negotiator. She possessed enough political insight to recognize that she would be executed and attempted to negotiate her fate. The myth of the simple shepherdess was necessary for France. It conveyed that God hears even the smallest of his creations. A hero can emerge from nowhere. Yet the real Jeanne was more complex, and perhaps even more magnificent because of it. This myth was born from a democratic ideal that was imposed upon a medieval reality. The next was born from an even greater ideal: freedom, which turned out to be freedom for only a few. Myth number 18. Revolution for all. All men are created equal. These words from the Declaration of Independence resonate as the foundation of the American dream and American identity. The American Revolution of 1776, in the popular imagination, was a struggle for the freedom of the entire populace against British tyranny. Colonists united by a thirst for independence, throwing off the yoke of the metropolis. But it is worth asking, the whole populace? Is this really true? Of the 3 million residents of the American colonies at the time, about 500,000 were black slaves. Another few 100,000 were Native Americans. Neither group was included in any real sense in the struggle for freedom. Furthermore, many of them actively fought alongside the British Crown. Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation in 1775 promising freedom to all enslaved individuals and indentured servants who would escape from their patriot owners and join British forces. This was an astute strategic maneuver, and it worked. Thousands of enslaved people fled to the British lines. From their perspective, the British Crown was a liberator, while the Founding Fathers were their jailers. Some of the principal founders of freedom were large slaveholders. George Washington owned more than 200 enslaved individuals at various times. Thomas Jefferson, who famously wrote that all men are created equal, held over 600 enslaved people throughout his life, while fully acknowledging the contradictions in private correspondence. Indigenous peoples largely sided with the British, and not without reason. London issued a proclamation in 1763, banning colonists from settling west of the Appalachians, effectively attempting to halt the expansion into native lands. For most indigenous peoples, American independence signified the end of this protection and the beginning of relentless encroachment on their territories. The American Revolution was real and significant for white male landowners who were its driving force and principal beneficiaries. For the remaining 3/4 of the population, it was either alien or hostile. This does not render it insignificant, but it fundamentally alters the question of freedom for whom. This myth arises from the nation's need for a foundational narrative of freedom. The next myth is born out of gender, more specifically, assumptions about it. Myth number 19. The pharaoh in feminine form. Pharaoh, a term that inherently carries a masculine connotation. When we envision Egyptian rulers, we see men adorned in the double crown, wielding scepters and flails. Cleopatra is the exception that proves the rule. Hatshepsut, if she is remembered at all, is another rare exception. But what if the rule itself is incorrect? Let's begin with Hatshepsut. She reigned over Egypt in the 15th century BCE as a pharaoh, not as a regent or a queen mother, but as a fully fledged pharaoh with official titles, cartouches, and depictions in a male form wearing a false beard. Official art represented her as a man, not because she concealed her gender, but because the concept of pharaoh demanded a specific iconography. At the same time, there were representations where she was portrayed as a woman. No one at court was misled about her biological sex. Hatshepsut ruled for about 22 years, longer than most male pharaohs. Her reign was a prosperous time. Trade expeditions to the enigmatic land of Punt, the construction of an imposing temple at Deir el-Bahari, and the restoration of monuments destroyed by the Hyksos. After her death, her successor Thutmose III systematically destroyed her images, erasing faces, bricking up statues. For a long time, historians believed that this was a form of revenge for years of undermining his authority. Today, a different interpretation prevails. The destruction occurred towards the end of Thutmose III's reign and was an attempt to ensure a smooth transfer of power to his son by eliminating an alternative line of succession. Hatshepsut was not alone. Nefertiti, whose significance during Akhenaten's reign, according to various accounts, extended beyond the official title of Great Royal Wife, may have ruled as a co-regent. There is a hypothesis, supported by several Egyptologists, that after Akhenaten's death, she could have ascended the throne under the masculine name Nefer-Neferuaten. The evidence remains inconclusive, and the debate continues. Nitakerti Sita, Sobekneferu, Taweret. These names may be obscure to the general public, but each belonged to a woman who ruled Egypt as a pharaoh. Egyptology is gradually bringing them out of obscurity. The role of a pharaoh was not exclusively male. It was a concept that could manifest in different bodies depending on the circumstances. Our notion of the pharaoh as a man is a projection of our own biases rather than an Egyptian reality. This myth is born from our tendency to view the past through the lens of contemporary prejudices. Another arises from a habit of depicting weakness where there was tragedy. Myth number 20. The Tsar who went unnoticed. Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor. In the public imagination, he is viewed as a soft, ineffectual man who was manipulated by his wife, Rasputin, and circumstances. A ruler who did not understand his country, showed little interest in governance, and was wholly absorbed in his family and hunting. The weak Tsar has become an almost official label, passed from one textbook to another. This characterization is unfair, and in an interesting way. Nicholas II was evidently one of the most diligent officials among all Russian czars. He personally read and signed thousands of documents each year. His diaries and letters reflect a person who worked daily for hours with meticulous attention to detail. Count Witta, the long-serving finance minister, who was hardly suspected of having any sympathy for Nicholas, noted his phenomenal memory and ability to retain vast amounts of state information. The issue lay elsewhere. He worked hard, but he struggled to delegate and was unable to make systematic decisions. He was an excellent official, but a poor statesman. He could see the trees, but not the forest. Under Nicholas II, Russia experienced one of the most remarkable periods of economic growth in its history. In the 1900s, the pace of Russian economic growth was among the highest in the world. Railways were being constructed, the Trans-Siberian Railway was completed during his reign. The population was rapidly increasing. The Stolypin reforms, which Nicholas supported, granted peasants the right to leave the commune. This was a radical shift in land relations. The image of the weak Tsar was largely created by Soviet historiography, which required a depiction of a decayed power unable to govern the country. The image of being under Rasputin's heel has been shaped by the memoirs of aristocrats seeking explanations for the catastrophe. The reality, however, was much more tragic and complex. An intelligent, honest, and hard-working individual was in a position that demanded entirely different qualities. That of a charismatic leader, capable of guiding the people during a time of revolution. This myth was born from the need of the victors to craft a specific image of the vanquished. Another comes from the necessity of diplomacy to conceal the actual events. Myth number 21. The Cold War that burned. The term Cold War itself implies a conflict without gunfire, two blocks, two ideologies, two nuclear arsenals, and a carefully maintained distance between them. Proxy wars, spies, and an arms race, yes. But there was no direct military confrontation between Soviet and American forces, or so we were taught. This is the commonly accepted belief. However, this is not entirely accurate. The Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, witnessed American pilots frequently engaging in aerial battles with aircraft piloted by Soviet aviators. MiGs in the skies over Korea were often flown by Soviet pilots in Soviet military uniforms, merely repainted with Chinese identification marks. Documents from Soviet archives, declassified in the 90s, confirm that Soviet military pilots participated directly in the aerial combat over Korea. Fallen Soviet pilots were secretly buried, while their families were informed that they had died while on duty without further details. Vietnam presents a similar picture. Soviet anti-aircraft crews operated air defense systems that shot down American planes. Soviet military advisors worked in close proximity to combat zones. American and Soviet troops killed each other, just through intermediaries and with meticulous adherence to the norms of denial. Even more critically, in 1963, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarine B-59, under American depth charge bombardment and out of contact with Moscow, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. According to Soviet protocols, launching nuclear weapons required the agreement of 3 officers. The captain and the political officer both consented. Only the 3rd officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. One person, whose name is nearly unknown, prevented nuclear war. The Cold War was only cold at the level of official declarations. In reality, it was a war with real casualties on both sides, which both parties preferred to ignore. This myth arose from the diplomatic necessity to avoid labeling a conflict a war. The next myth emerges from the convenient image of a suffering genius. Myth number 22. The Poor Prophet with a Rich Friend, Karl Marx. The author of Das Kapital, the father of scientific socialism, a man whose ideas changed the world. In biographical sketches, his life in London is portrayed as one of continuous poverty. He writes a work that will upend the global order from a destitute apartment, mired in debt and illness, a living embodiment of the suffering proletarian who understands the proletariat from within. This narrative is neither entirely false nor completely true. Marx did indeed experience hardship, at times catastrophic hardship. His family lived in cramped apartments, and several of his children died in infancy from health issues linked to their living conditions. There were stretches when they couldn't afford fuel. Moneylenders, mortgages, and humiliating pleas for loans were all part of his reality during his years in London. However, Friedrich Engels was always nearby. This adds complexity to the picture. Engels came from a family of industrialists. His father owned a textile factory in Manchester, the very same one described by Engels in The Condition of the Working Class in England. Engels worked as a manager at this factory, earning a salary that allowed him to live rather comfortably. Horse racing, hunting with hounds, and regular meals at fine restaurants were all part of Engels's life in Manchester. And for almost all this time, he subsidized Marx. Regular monetary transfers and substantial one-time amounts. Historians estimate that over the years of their friendship, Engels sent Marx sums equivalent to several million modern euros. When, in 1869, Engels sold his stake in the Manchester factory, he received a large sum and immediately provided Marx with a regular annual allowance sufficient for a middle-class lifestyle. This does not diminish the significance of capital. However, it casts doubt on the image of the scholar proletarian. The person who authored the seminal work on capitalist exploitation largely lived off the profits of a capitalist factory. Engels, who criticized factory labor, was managing a factory. The contradiction is so stark that both Marx and Engels acknowledged it and occasionally joked about it in private correspondence. This myth was born from the romanticization of intellectual suffering. The next is born from the desire to find a measure of absolute heroism in history. Myth number 23. The 300 who were more. The 300 Spartans. This image has become a symbol, perhaps the most recognizable in world military history. A handful of heroes standing against countless hordes. The pass at Thermopylae, the final stand. Come and take. 300 men who halted Persia and saved Western civilization. The reality was not so straightforward. First of all, the 300. Yes, 300 Spartans, full citizens of Sparta, were indeed at Thermopylae under the command of King Leonidas. But they did not come alone. Alongside them were 700 Thespian soldiers, 400 Thespians, and several thousand warriors from other Greek city-states according to various sources. Moreover, each Spartan had an helot, a serf who served them. In total, there were likely between 4,000 and 7,000 men at Thermopylae. Why then 300? Because after the betrayal by the local resident Ephialtes, who revealed to the Persians a bypass through the mountains, Leonidas sent most of the allies home. Only the 300 Spartans remained, along with the 700 Thespian soldiers. The Thespians chose to stay voluntarily because they realized the Persians had already destroyed their hometown, leaving them nowhere to go. They all perished, every last one. However, 300 refers to the Spartans. At that time, Sparta was already becoming a legend, and it actively promoted this status. The Thespians, who died nearby, faded into the shadows. Their names did not become symbols. Their city was destroyed and never regained its former significance. There was no one to tell their story. Another crucial point is that Thermopylae was a tactical defeat. The Persians advanced, the Greeks retreated. Athens was burned. Victory came later, at Salamis and Plataea, in naval and land battles where the Greeks fought differently. Thermopylae became a grand tale, but a tale of a lost battle. Their victory was psychological rather than strategic. This myth was born from the need for a model of sacrifice that overshadows those who sacrificed no less. The next myth emerged from one of the most captivating detective cases in history. Myth number 24. Princes in the Shadow of Accusation. The summer of 1483, the Tower of London, two young princes, 12-year-old Edward and 9-year-old Richard, enter the fortress and never come out. Their uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, becomes King Richard III. A villain, a murderer of his nephews, a hunchback with a black soul. Shakespeare crafted one of the most memorable villains in world literature. "I am a villain," says Shakespeare's Richard. Such words were spoken convincingly, and the world believed. However, what's interesting is that there is no evidence of the prince's murder by Richard III. Not a single piece. The bodies of the princes were never officially discovered during his lifetime. Under Charles II, Children's bones were found in the tower. They were ceremoniously reburied as the remains of the princes, yet without any scientific methods for identification. Modern DNA analysis could have been possible, but permission to excavate the royal burial site was never granted. Chronologically, everything is much more complex. The princes disappeared in 1483. Richard ruled for 2 years, until his death at Bosworth in 1485. After his victory at Bosworth, Henry VII Tudor ascended to the throne, and it was under him and his successors that the image of Richard as a villain was crafted. The historian Polydore Virgil, who wrote the first official history, worked at the court of Henry VII. Thomas More, whose history of Richard III became the main source for Shakespeare, wrote nearly 30 years after the events, under Henry VIII. Henry VII had direct reasons to depict Richard as a monster. His own claims to the throne were legally weaker than Richard's, and the demonization of his predecessor helped legitimize the Tudor rule. So who killed the princes? There are theories involving Henry Tudor himself, or his allies, who eliminated potential claimants before his reign. Another theory involves John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who stood to gain directly from the death of the princes. There is also a theory suggesting that the princes were secretly taken abroad. The mystery remains unsolved. But the condemnation has occurred. The name of Richard III continues to signify a murderer, without trial, without evidence, without a body. This myth was birthed from the propaganda of victors, which has since evolved into literature. The next one arises from propaganda that has outlived its creator. Myth number 25, the Austrian who was loved. Austria's corporal. Such a derogatory term was used by Hitler's political adversaries. An outsider, a foreigner, who Germans should have rejected solely based on his origins. An outlier, who deceived and manipulated to seize control of a nation. This narrative is convenient. It alleviates a significant portion of responsibility from the Germans, depicting them as victims of an outsider. The reality is far more complex. Yes, Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn, an Austrian town, in the year 1889. Indeed, he remained an Austrian citizen until 1932, when he acquired German citizenship, shortly before rising to power. Formally, he was an outsider. But look at the reality of his life. From the age of 18, he resided in Vienna. At the age of 24, he moved to Munich. It was in Bavaria that his political beliefs took shape. It was here that he enlisted in the army in 1914, not in the Austrian army, but in the Bavarian one. It was here that he founded the NSDAP. For him, Austria represented a youthful failure, a provincial town that had rejected him as an artist. Germany embodied his identity, his passion, his mission. The Germans did not perceive him as a foreigner. In November 1923, during the Beer Hall Putsch, he was released early after a brief prison term. In the elections of 1932, he garnered 37% of the votes, in a legitimate election with genuine competition. This represented 1/3 of the German electorate, voting intentionally. The argument of the Austrian outsider was crafted by post-war Germany, which needed to make sense of what transpired. If Hitler was not one of us, then what happened was a tragic invasion by an alien element. If he was one of us, then much more uncomfortable questions must be asked. This myth is born from a national inability to confront its reflection. The next one stems from the enduring prejudice about barbarians who could only destroy. Myth number 26. Barbarians with bureaucracy. Mongols. Just hearing this word conjures images of Genghis Khan, fire, sword, and pyramids of skulls. The largest land empire in the history of humanity, and the image of its creators reduces to one word: destruction. The Mongols were only capable of conquest, not of building. Conquered peoples were annihilated, cultures erased, cities reduced to ashes. This is half the truth, the half that is easiest to remember. The Mongolian Pax Mongolica, Mongolian peace, a period of relative stability from China to Poland in the 13th and 14th centuries, was a real phenomenon. After the conquests, trade routes across Eurasia became safer than ever before. Marco Polo managed to travel from Venice to China not because the world had become kinder, but due to the unified Mongolian authority providing safety along the entirety of the Great Silk Road. The Mongolian administration was structured in a pragmatic and flexible manner. Conquered regions typically retained their local officials and laws, unless they resisted. Religious tolerance was a fundamental policy. In the Mongolian capitals, Buddhist temples, Christian churches, mosques, and shamanic practices coexisted simultaneously. Papal envoys who visited the courts of the great Khans, hoping to convert them to Christianity, returned astonished, not by brutality, but by the organization and diversity they witnessed. The most renowned Mongolian Khan is not Genghis, but his grandson, Kublai Khan, who established the Yuan dynasty in China. Under his rule, new canals, roads, and postal systems were built, along with the capital Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing. His court became a hub for the arts and scholarship. Destruction was a reality, especially during the initial period of conquests. The capture of Baghdad in 1258 marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and was a true catastrophe. However, this was one of the methods of Mongolian policy, demonstrative punishment for those who resisted. Those who surrendered without a fight were generally spared. The Mongols were ruthless conquerors and skilled administrators. These two aspects coexisted within them without apparent contradiction, which perhaps speaks more about the nature of governance in general than about the Mongols in particular. This myth was born from the notion that burning cities linger in memory longer than functioning postal stations. The next myth stems from a disaster that history has simplified into a single fire. Myth number 27, the library that burned for long. The Library of Alexandria, a major symbol of loss, the greatest repository of knowledge from the ancient world, and its destruction in a single moment in a single fire. Barbarians, or Caesar, or the Arabs, depending on the version, set the building ablaze, scrolls burn, knowledge perishes, the world descends into darkness. The issue is that none of these single fires constituted that definitive destruction. Let's start with the basics. The Library of Alexandria, or more precisely, the Mouseion with its repositories, was not a single building. It was a system of storage and scholarship, distributed across several locations in the city. The main storeroom was located in Brucheion, the royal quarter. An additional one was situated near the Serapeum Temple in another part of the city. The first of the fires occurred during Julius Caesar's time in 48 BC. Caesar ordered part of the Alexandrian fleet in the harbor to be set on fire. The flames spread to the coastal warehouses. Some scrolls, possibly copies intended for shipment, were destroyed. This was a fire in the harbor, not in the library. Strabo, who visited Alexandria several decades later, described the Mouseion as a thriving institution. The second incident occurred during the reign of Emperor Aurelian in 1272, when he suppressed a rebellion in Alexandria. During the battles, the royal quarter was destroyed, possibly including a portion of the main storage facility. The third event, Theophilus of Alexandria destroyed the Serapeum as a pagan temple in the year 1391. It is possible that a storage of scrolls was located there. This was part of the Christian campaign against pagan cults. The fourth event, the Arab conquest in the year 1641. The famous story of Caliph Omar saying, "If the books contradict the Quran, burn them. If they agree, there is no need," is likely a later fabrication. Arab sources do not support this account. The true history of the Library of Alexandria is one of gradual decline, diminished funding, the exodus of scholars, a general collapse of imperial culture. Fires, raids, and religious transformations all dealt significant blows. However, there was no single day, no single fire, no sole villain responsible. There was an era that slowly ceased to appreciate what was held within those walls. This myth arises from the need for a specific moment of tragedy. The next stems from the notion that behind charlatanry lay genuine science. Myth number 28. The alchemist who did not seek gold. Medieval alchemists are a caricature firmly entrenched in culture that is almost impossible to dismantle. Charlatans in dark basements, blowing into bellows over boiling cauldrons, deceiving the wealthy with promises of the philosopher's stone and eternal life. This is not science. This is greed, superstition, and fraud. The reality is far more complex and fascinating. Alchemy was a proto-science, a system of inquiry into the natural world that preceded modern scientific methods. Yes, its theoretical foundations were flawed. The notion that all substances are composed of four elements, that metals can be transmuted by altering their spiritual essence is not physics. However, within these erroneous theories, alchemists conducted something truly real. They performed experiments. Indeed, alchemists developed most of the fundamental chemical procedures that underpin modern chemistry: distillation, sublimation, filtration, crystallization. All of these are alchemical techniques that later became chemical processes. They discovered mineral acids, created the first accurate scales for measuring chemical reactions, and developed techniques for analyzing metallic alloys. Jabir ibn Hayyan, an Arab scholar from the 8th to 9th centuries, known as Geber in the West, authored hundreds of treatises that laid the groundwork for systematic chemistry. His descriptions of the synthesis of various compounds are so precise that contemporary chemists can reproduce his experiments. Paracelsus, a Swiss alchemist physician of the 16th century, reformed medicine by introducing the concepts of dosage and specific chemical agents for specific diseases, the foundation of pharmacology. Isaac Newton, regarded as the founder of modern science, dedicated more time to alchemy than to physics. His alchemical manuscripts total thousands of pages. This was not a hobby, but serious work. He sought connections between the material and spiritual worlds with the same diligence with which he explored the laws of gravitation. Alchemy was not mere charlatanry. It was a science that lacked a sufficiently precise language to articulate its observations, yet it was indeed observing. Modern chemistry has evolved from alchemy just as astronomy has emerged from astrology, dismissing the theory while inheriting the methodology. This myth arises from the arrogance of subsequent science, reluctant to acknowledge its debts. The next myth is born from military history, which chooses to overlook the transitional phases. Myth number 29, the knight who wasn't shot immediately. Gunpowder, musket, the end of chivalry. That's the narrative we're told. The advent of firearms in the 14th and 15th centuries rendered armored knights obsolete in an instant, sending them to the annals of history with one technological leap: steel versus gunpowder. Steel, lost. This is one of the most prevalent examples of how history favors clear turning points where reality evolved gradually. Firearms appeared in Europe in the early 14th century. By the mid-15th century, they were widely disseminated. The end of chivalry? Not at all. Here's what actually transpired. Early guns, arquebuses, muskets, were slow to load, unreliable in damp conditions, possessed low accuracy, and required extensive training for the shooter. A heavily armored cavalry knight on a galloping horse is a challenging target for a lone musketeer who needs several seconds to reload. For this reason, tactics quickly adapted. Musketeers were arranged in multiple ranks, firing volleys in succession. While the first rank reloaded, the second rank fired. However, knights did not disappear. They adapted. Armor grew thicker, especially breastplates, specifically in response to firearms. The famous full-plate armor of the 15th to early 16th century was a result of gunpowder rather than a precursor to it. The practice of testing armor for bullet resistance, shooting trials on breastplates, emerged precisely during this period, giving rise to the distinctive dents we observe on museum artifacts. Heavy cavalry remained a decisive force on the battlefield for nearly 200 years after the introduction of gunpowder. The Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, one of the key battles of the 30 Years' War, was resolved by a cavalry charge. The Polish winged hussars, the heaviest cavalry of their time, decisively swept away the Turkish army at Vienna in 1683, achieving one of the largest cavalry victories in history, 300 years after the advent of gunpowder. Chivalry did not die from a bullet. It succumbed to a shift in the economic model of warfare, where mass infantry composed of taxpayers became cheaper than maintaining mounted knights. It also fell victim to a political transformation, when nation-states seized military monopolies from feudal lords. This myth emerges from our fascination with pure technological breakthroughs. The last myth is a result of the Age of Enlightenment not being as enlightened as we thought. Myth number 30. Light that did not dispel the darkness. The Enlightenment, the 18th century. Reason triumphs over superstition. Science conquers religion. Enlightened monarchs and humanistic philosophers lay the groundwork for the modern world. Voltaire ridicules the church. Diderot creates the encyclopedia. Kant urges us to have the courage to use your own understanding. Darkness recedes. Light emerges. This is the official narrative. The self-account of the era, which it crafted for itself and which we have eagerly accepted. The reality of the same 18th century appeared quite different. It was during the Enlightenment that European slave trade reached its absolute peak. The 18th century marks the highest volume of slave transit across the Atlantic. Philosophers who wrote about human rights and the dignity of reason resided in nations whose economies relied on the labor of people stripped of all rights. Montesquieu condemns slavery in theory in the spirit of the laws, yet immediately finds practical justifications for it. Locke, who proclaimed the natural rights of man, participated in drafting the Constitution of Carolina, which legalized slavery in the American colonies. The enlightened monarchs of the era, Frederick the Great and Catherine II, were, despite their intellectual brilliance, absolute rulers who allowed no real limitation on their power. Catherine's correspondence with Voltaire serves as an example of mutual admiration. However, the reality of serfdom in Russia under her rule was somewhat different. Superstition did not simply vanish. It migrated. The 18th century was the zenith of Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Martinism, and alchemical and magical societies. Mesmer, with his animal magnetism, commanded the attention of Parisian salons, those very places where Voltaire and Rousseau were discussed. Casanova practiced magic alongside philosophical debates with Enlightenment thinkers. Count Saint-Germain, a figure both legendary and semi-mythical, was welcomed in the finest homes across Europe. The anti-religious impulse of the Enlightenment was genuine, but it did not defeat religion. It transformed it. New quasi-religions emerged to replace traditional Christianity. The cult of reason, the cult of progress, the cult of nation. The latter particularly manifested with vigor during the revolutionary France, where the guillotine operated in the name of reason with just as much fervor as the Inquisition once did in the name of God. The Enlightenment was a real intellectual movement that laid down true foundations for the modern world, yet it was riddled with contradictions that the Enlighteners preferred to overlook. To label this era as the victory of reason over superstition is to accept its own advertisement at face value. Here are 30 archives, 30 stories that history has chosen to simplify. Each of these myths endured for long because they were convenient, for power, for the church, for the nation, for the pride of victors. The reality proved to be more complex, contradictory, and human, and it is precisely for this reason that it was concealed behind a beautiful facade. But complexity is not a weakness of history, it is its strength. A person who understands that Cleopatra triumphed with her intellect, that traditions are forged over decades, that great villains built nations while great heroes lost battles, such a person views the present with greater clarity. Because it understands, simple explanations are seldom the truth. The archive is closed. Until next time.